The story of Africa's part in the slave trade stretches across centuries, beginning long before European ships appeared on its coasts and continuing through a tragic transformation of human relationships into commodities that fueled empires. In early African societies, slavery was not initially associated with the racial hierarchies and dehumanization that later defined the transatlantic slave trade. Many African communities practiced systems of servitude that were complex and deeply integrated into social, political, and economic life. A person could become enslaved through war, debt, punishment for crime, or as a result of famine. But these individuals often retained some rights, could marry, own property, or even rise to positions of influence within households and kingdoms. Slavery in pre-colonial Africa, though oppressive, was often an extension of kinship systems, and in many regions it did not necessarily mean a lifetime of bondage. However, the arrival of foreign traders seeking human beings as commodities would reshape this institution into something far more brutal and enduring. In West Africa, the roots of servitude were linked to the structure of kingdoms and empires such as Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. These states depended heavily on warfare for expansion, and captives were often taken as part of tribute systems or used as laborers and soldiers. During the height of the Mali Empire in the 14th century, for example, enslaved people worked in agriculture, mining, and domestic service. Some were even part of the armies that defended the empire's vast territories. Yet these systems operated within African society's own norms and values, and while they could be harsh, they were not designed to destroy entire populations or remove people permanently from their homelands. It was a world that still held the possibility of reintegration and humanity. This balance began to shift as contact between African merchants and the outside world deepened. The earliest foreign involvement in African slavery came from North Africa and the Middle East through the trans-Saharan slave trade, which existed centuries before Europeans began sailing around the coast. Arab and Berber traders carried enslaved Africans across the Sahara Desert to markets in Morocco, Egypt, Arabia, and beyond. The demand was particularly strong for domestic servants, soldiers, and eunuchs. Over time, entire networks developed that linked sub-Saharan Africa with Islamic civilizations to the north. The East African coast also became part of this trade, with Swahili city-states like Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar serving as key ports. From there, enslaved Africans were sent to Persia, India, and even as far as China. The Arab slave trade was extensive and long-lasting, stretching from the 7th century until well into the 19th. It was sustained by both economic and cultural factors. Islam permitted slavery under certain conditions, and enslaved people could be integrated into Muslim households as concubines, servants, or soldiers. In some cases, they could gain freedom through conversion or marriage. Nevertheless, the scale of human movement was immense and the suffering profound. Estimates suggest that between 10 and 18 million Africans were taken in the Arab slave trade over more than a millennium. Though it differed from the later European trade in its forms and purposes, it shared with it the essential act of reducing human lives to property. By the late 15th century, European ships began appearing on the western shores of Africa, marking a new and catastrophic era in global history. The Portuguese were among the first to explore the Atlantic coast, seeking gold, spices, and routes to Asia. They soon realized that human beings could become another form of profitable cargo. Initially, they bought small numbers of enslaved Africans to work on sugar plantations in Madeira, Cape Verde, and São Tomé. As European colonization of the Americas accelerated, the demand for labor grew exponentially. The native populations of the New World, decimated by disease and violence, could not meet the labor needs of the new colonies. Africans became the solution. At first, the Europeans depended heavily on African intermediaries to obtain captives. African kings, chiefs, and merchants saw opportunities in this trade. In many coastal regions, such as the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, and the Congo, local rulers organized raiding expeditions into the interior, capturing men, women, and children to exchange for European goods. These goods, guns, textiles, alcohol, and metal tools, transformed local economies and power structures. The rise of kingdoms such as Dahomey, Benin, and Oyo in West Africa was closely tied to their involvement in the slave trade. Some rulers justified their participation by claiming that they were ridding their lands of criminals or enemies, But the reality was that the insatiable European demand drove wars, kidnappings, and betrayals that tore societies apart. The process of capture was brutal. Villages were raided at night, people chained together, and marched for weeks or months to the coast. Those who survived the journey faced confinement in dark, airless fortresses such as Elmina Castle or Gorée Island, where they awaited the ships that would carry them across the Atlantic. The Middle Passage, as it came to be known, was one of the most horrific chapters in human history. Enslaved Africans were packed tightly into the holds of ships, with barely enough room to move. Disease, malnutrition, and abuse claimed countless lives. It is estimated that between 12 and 15 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic between the 16th and 19th centuries, and millions more died before ever reaching the ships. Once in the Americas, enslaved Africans were sold at auction and forced to work in plantations producing sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee, the commodities that fueled European wealth and industrialization. The labor of Africans built much of the economic foundation of the modern world. But this system depended on the continued cooperation of African suppliers, and European traders ensured that dependence through a steady flow of goods and weapons. Over time, the Atlantic slave trade reshaped entire regions of Africa. Populations were depleted, villages destroyed, and social cohesion shattered. The introduction of firearms led to escalating cycles of violence. Kingdoms that refused to participate found themselves attacked by neighbors who did. Yet Africa was not a passive victim in this history. The continent's rulers and merchants made strategic choices within the constraints of global forces. Some resisted the trade, attempting to ban the sale of their people or to find alternative sources of wealth. Leaders such as King Afonso I of Congo wrote desperate letters to the Portuguese monarchs in the early 16th century, pleading for an end to the enslavement of his subjects, arguing that the trade was destroying his kingdom. But his appeals were ignored. Other rulers, like those of Dahomey, embraced the trade fully, using its profits to build armies and palaces. They conducted large-scale raids and wars specifically to capture people for sale. In some regions, the impact of the slave trade went beyond immediate human loss. It altered gender ratios, leaving women to bear the burdens of agriculture and family in societies stripped of men. It disrupted trade routes and production systems that had sustained communities for centuries. The moral and psychological damage was incalculable. The slave trade also reshaped Africa's relationship with the rest of the world, creating a long-lasting image of the continent as a supplier of human labor rather than a partner in civilization. The 18th century saw the transatlantic slave trade reach its peak. British, French, Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish traders competed fiercely for African captives. Coastal forts became centers of commerce and suffering. European ships would anchor offshore while African brokers brought captives for inspection and sale. The profits were enormous, and the triangle of trade, manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, and raw materials back to Europe, became the backbone of global capitalism. Meanwhile, inside Africa, the ripple effects intensified. Regions like the Niger Delta and the Bight of Biafra became scenes of relentless warfare. The Oyo Empire grew rich from selling captives, but eventually collapsed under the same violence it had unleashed. Despite this devastation, African societies continued to show resilience. In some areas, local forms of slavery persisted alongside the export trade. Domestic slaves were employed in agriculture, mining, and administration, while concubines and servants lived in households of the elite. But these internal systems were increasingly distorted by the demands of the transatlantic market. The boundary between local servitude and foreign enslavement blurred, and people who once might have been integrated into families instead found themselves chained and sold to strangers. The 19th century brought dramatic changes. European abolitionist movements began to challenge the morality of the slave trade. Britain outlawed the transatlantic trade in 1807 and used its navy to intercept slave ships along the African coast. The Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron rescued tens of thousands of captives, though many had already suffered beyond measure. The abolition movement also inspired African reactions. Some rulers saw the end of the trade as an opportunity to shift to legitimate commerce in palm oil, ivory, and other goods. Others, however, resisted, fearing the loss of revenue and power. In East Africa, the Arab slave trade persisted well into the late 19th century, with Zanzibar serving as a major hub under Omani control. Caravans carried thousands of Africans to the coast each year, bound for Middle Eastern markets. As the century progressed, European powers began to reframe their relationship with Africa under the guise of humanitarianism and commerce. The suppression of the slave trade became one of the justifications for colonial conquest. At the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, European nations divided Africa among themselves, claiming that they would bring civilization, Christianity, and free trade. In reality, colonialism extended many of the same exploitative dynamics that slavery had established. Africans were once again forced into labor systems, plantations, mines, railways, under coercion and violence. The abolition of the slave trade did not mean the abolition of exploitation. It simply changed its form. Yet the legacy of Africa's part in the slave trade cannot be reduced to victimhood alone. The continent's people endured unimaginable suffering, but they also adapted, resisted, and survived. In places like Sierra Leone and Liberia, freed slaves and their descendants established new societies, blending African and Western traditions. Across the continent, memory and oral history preserved the pain and lessons of the past. The rhythms, languages, and beliefs carried by enslaved Africans shaped cultures across the Americas. From Brazil to the Caribbean to the United States, the long arc of Africa's involvement in slavery reveals both tragedy and complexity. African elites participated in the trade for their own gain, but they operated in a world increasingly dominated by European demand and control. The moral responsibility is therefore shared across continents, a web of complicity that spanned oceans. The human cost, however, fell most heavily on Africans themselves, those captured, sold, and torn from their homelands. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the memory of slavery continues to influence Africa's global identity. Many African nations, after gaining independence from colonial rule, sought to reclaim their history and confront the legacies of slavery and imperialism. Museums, memorials, and heritage sites such as Gorée Island in Senegal or the Cape Coast Castle in Ghana stand as reminders of this painful past. Pilgrimages by members of the African diaspora to these sites symbolize both mourning and reconnection. Modern historians have worked to uncover the full scope of Africa's role in the slave trade, not merely as a passive source of labor, but as an active participant in a global system of exchange and exploitation. Archaeological studies, oral traditions, and written records reveal how deeply intertwined slavery was with political power, wealth, and survival in African societies. The story is not one of simple guilt or innocence, but of choices made under immense pressure, of cooperation and resistance, of humanity struggling within the machinery of greed. The scars of the slave trade remain visible today. The depopulation of vast regions, the loss of generations of labor and talent, and the distortion of economies and cultures all contributed to Africa's later struggles under colonialism and beyond. Some scholars argue that the slave trade set the stage for Europe's domination by weakening African states and creating internal divisions. Others point out that despite this, Africa continued to produce powerful civilizations and resilient communities that rebuilt themselves after catastrophe. The modern descendants of the enslaved, whether in Africa, the Americas, or Europe, carry with them a shared legacy of endurance. Their cultures, music, religions, and family structures all bear traces of the journeys that began on African soil. The slave trade was not just a story of loss, but also of transformation, of how African identities spread and adapted across the world. Today, efforts at reconciliation and remembrance are ongoing. Governments and organizations have issued apologies, while academic and cultural institutions strive to tell the full story. Yet the most powerful testimony lies in the survival of African peoples and cultures themselves. Despite centuries of enslavement, colonization, and exploitation, Africa remains a continent of immense diversity, creativity, and resilience. The history of Africa's part in the slave trade, then, is not only a chronicle of suffering, but also a lesson in human endurance. It is a story that begins in local systems of servitude and kinship, expands into global networks of commerce and cruelty, and ultimately reminds us of the capacity of human beings to survive even the darkest chapters of history. The trade reshaped Africa and the world, creating diasporas that continue to influence global culture, politics, and identity. Its echoes can still be heard in the music of the Caribbean, the churches of the American South, and the streets of West African towns where ancestors once awaited ships to foreign lands. To understand this story is to confront both the brutality and the humanity that define our shared past. Africa's involvement in the slave trade was a product of its time and circumstance, a reflection of internal dynamics and external pressures. But it was also a human tragedy of unimaginable scale. Millions of lives uprooted, families destroyed, and societies transformed. The memory of that suffering endures, not to assign blame, but to ensure that the lessons of history are never forgotten.